The sun had just begun to set, casting a warm golden hue across the quiet neighborhood. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and everything seemed peaceful until something unexpected happened. A dog, dirty, malnourished, and clearly lost, appeared at the edge of the street. It looked up at a house, its eyes filled with both desperation and hope, and then, almost as if it sensed its future was about to change, it slowly walked up to the front door. The family inside had no idea that, within a matter of hours, their lives would be completely transformed. It was an ordinary day for them, a mom and dad trying to juggle work and home life, kids racing through the halls, laughter filling the air. But nothing in their busy lives could have prepared them for the sudden arrival of this stray dog. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into, or how this moment would alter everything they knew about love, family, and loyalty. At first, the dog was a mystery. The family thought they might be able to call animal control or find its owners. It was hard to ignore the heartbreak in its eyes, though, the way it tentatively sat on the doorstep, waiting for someone to notice. But they did more than just notice. Without saying much, they opened the door and invited this frightened animal into their lives, completely unaware that this small act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would test their patience, their hearts, and their understanding of what it means to be a family. As the days went by, something incredible began to unfold. The dog, once skittish and mistrustful, started to open up. It wagged its tail when the kids approached, barked joyfully when someone came home, and even curled up on the couch at night, as if it had always been there. But the transformation wasn't just happening with the dog. The family began to change too. They were learning things they never expected about themselves, about love that doesn't come with conditions, and the kind of loyalty that only a pet can offer. But just when things seemed to be settling into a beautiful rhythm, something happened that no one saw coming. A phone call. The kind of call that brings with it a flood of emotions, confusion, and uncertainty. It was news that made them question everything they had come to understand about their new companion and their place in this unexpected story. What was the real story behind this stray dog? And what would this family do when the answers threatened to change everything? This is a story of love, courage, and the kind of bonds that defy all odds. The journey of this family and their new dog wasn't just a story about adopting a pet, it was about discovering the true meaning of family. But the questions, the tension, and the twists? Well, those are only just beginning to unfold. Stay tuned as we continue this incredible journey, because what happens next will leave you breathless. The phone call had come just after dinner, the family sitting around the table, chatting about their day, the dog lying quietly in its bed near the kitchen. The moment the phone rang, the dog's ears perked up, its body stiffened, as though it knew something was about to change. The father had answered, a casual hello that quickly shifted to confusion and concern. "Is this the family that took in the stray dog?" the voice on the other end of the line had asked. "Yes, that's us," he replied, trying to hide the sudden tension in his voice. "Is there something wrong?" The voice hesitated. "You need to know something about that dog. Something that might affect your decision to keep it." The father felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What could be wrong with the dog? Had it been sick? Did it have a dangerous history? He wasn't sure why, but a feeling of dread washed over him, as if the question had opened a door to something that couldn't be closed again. He glanced at his family. The children were excited, oblivious to the undercurrent of unease now in the room. The mother, though, had noticed the change in his expression. Her hand stopped midway to her mouth, her eyes narrowing with concern. Something wasn't right, she could feel it too. "Who are you?" the father asked, his voice firm now. "What's going on with this dog?" There was a long pause on the other end of line. It felt as though time itself had slowed. Finally, the voice spoke again, softer now, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but that dog, well, it's not just any stray. It's been through a lot, and you need to know that it's connected to a bigger situation. A situation that might put your family at risk." His heart skipped a beat. He could feel the tension mounting, could see his wife's face now mirroring the same confusion and fear. "What do you mean?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "You need to listen carefully," the voice continued, sounding almost reluctant to share more. "There's more to this dog's past than you think. A lot more." Before he could respond, the line went dead. The room was silent. The mother slowly put down her fork, her eyes wide. "What just happened?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. He didn't know how to answer. The children had noticed the change too, but they were too young to fully grasp what had just happened. "It's probably nothing," he said, trying to reassure them. But even as he said the words, he didn't believe them. Something was off. He felt it deep in his gut. The dog, still lying quietly by the door, seemed unaware of the tension in the room. But the father knew one thing for sure: this mystery had just begun. And whatever was happening, whatever danger this dog might be connected to, it was now a part of their lives too. In the days that followed, the family couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. The dog, despite its gentle nature, seemed to carry an invisible weight. It was as though it had seen things, been through things, that the family could never understand. And yet, there was an undeniable bond forming. They had given it a home, and in return, the dog had given them something they hadn't even realized they needed: a sense of unconditional love. But the mystery didn't end there. A few days later, the father had received another call, this time from an unfamiliar number. He answered cautiously, his mind still on edge from the first conversation. "Hello?" "Listen carefully," the voice said, its tone sharp and urgent. "You have to get rid of that dog. It's not safe. It's involved in something much bigger than you can imagine." The father felt his pulse quicken. "Who are you?" he demanded again. "Why are you saying this?" The voice didn't answer directly. "I can't tell you everything, not over the phone. But trust me, you don't want that dog in your home. It's been through things that can't be undone. It's not just a stray, it's a part of something dangerous." He could feel his heart racing. This wasn't just about a dog anymore, it was about their safety, their family's well-being. But who was behind these calls? Why were they so intent on driving them to get rid of their new pet? And what was the truth about this dog's past? As he paced the house, his mind raced with questions. What kind of danger was the voice talking about? And why had the dog chosen their house? He couldn't ignore the strange sense that it had come to them for a reason, as though fate had played a hand in bringing this animal into their lives. The dog had settled into a rhythm, now an integral part of the family. The children had started to form their own bond with it. They had even begun calling it a name, something simple, something that felt right. The dog responded to it, its ears perking up when they called it, its tail wagging eagerly. But despite the growing attachment, there was still an unsettling feeling lingering in the air, an unspoken fear that something was about to go horribly wrong. The tension continued to grow. The father couldn't stop thinking about the phone calls, the strange warnings that seemed to come out of nowhere. What did they know about this dog that he didn't? He began to dig deeper, trying to learn more about the dog's origins. There were no obvious signs of where it had come from. No tags, no microchip, nothing to indicate it had ever belonged to anyone. The family had brought it to the vet for a checkup, and the dog had been in surprisingly good health for a stray. But still, there were too many unanswered questions. And with each passing day, the pressure to figure out the truth weighed more heavily on him. One evening, as the father sat alone in his study, his laptop open in front of him, he stumbled across something that made his blood run cold. There was a report about a string of unusual disappearances in the area, a series of strange events that had baffled local authorities. The people involved were all connected to an underground network, one that was rumored to be involved in illegal activities. But there was something else in the report, something that made his stomach turn. There had been reports of a dog, similar to theirs, seen in the vicinity of the disappearances. Could it be? Was their dog connected to this underground network? Had it been involved in something far darker than anyone had imagined? His mind raced as he realized just how deep this mystery might go. His family, the life they had built, everything was on the line now. And he was no closer to understanding what was truly happening. As the night grew darker, he closed the laptop and stared at the dog, which was curled up on the couch in the living room. It was as if it sensed the shift in his thoughts. Its eyes met his, and for a moment, he saw something in them, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Regret? Or was it just a reflection of his own growing suspicion? The family's lives had already changed in so many ways since they had taken in this dog. But now, it was clear, there was more to this animal's story, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things were becoming. The father knew one thing for certain: this story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And he had no idea what would happen next. Days turned into weeks, and the family's life with the dog continued, but the air around them seemed thicker, charged with an unspoken tension. Every time the dog looked up at them with those wide, knowing eyes, it felt as though there was a story being left unsaid, something the animal couldn't or wouldn't reveal. It had brought them joy, laughter, and comfort, but it also brought something else: fear. And it wasn't just the father anymore. The whole family felt it now, even if they didn't fully understand it. The mother had begun waking up in the middle of the night, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the stress of the unknown, the pressure of the calls they'd been getting. But when she'd wake, the dog would be staring at her from the doorway, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. It didn't move, just watched her silently, as if it knew she was uneasy. The silence of those moments was what disturbed her the most. In the mornings, when she tried to tell herself it had been nothing, she couldn't help but glance at the dog and feel the weight of its gaze lingering on her. The kids, too, had started acting differently. At first, they were overjoyed by the dog's presence. They had named it, taken it for walks, played with it in the backyard. But now, they were more distant, as though the dog's moods were starting to affect them in ways they didn't fully understand. The youngest would sometimes stare out the window, watching the dog as it paced around the yard, and then suddenly turn and run to his room, a look of unease on his face. The older child had started drawing pictures of the dog, pictures that weren't just of a playful animal, but of shadows and dark shapes lurking around it. One afternoon, the father decided to confront the growing unease head-on. He couldn't ignore the whispers in the back of his mind any longer. He had to know what was going on with this dog, once and for all. With the mother at work and the kids at school, he took the dog to a nearby animal shelter, hoping to find some answers. Maybe there was something in its history, some record that could shed light on its mysterious past. The shelter staff recognized the dog immediately, though not in the way he'd hoped. They didn't pull up a file with helpful details or an ID chip. Instead, they exchanged uneasy glances as soon as he mentioned the dog's arrival. A woman behind the desk leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I don't know how to say this, but you need to be careful," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if to make sure no one else was listening. "That dog. It's been through a lot. It wasn't just abandoned, it was part of something else. Something dangerous." The father felt a chill sweep over him. "What do you mean?" The woman hesitated. "There are rumors. Things that don't make sense. People talk about this dog, about how it seems to follow a trail, almost like it's searching for something or someone. And every time someone adopts it, strange things start happening. You're not the first family it's been with." "But the others," she stopped herself, her face paling. The others, they don't end well. He was stunned. What do you mean, don't end well? What happened to the other families? I can't say much, she replied, looking nervously around again. But you might want to let it go. Get it out of your life before it's too late. Her words echoed in his mind as he left the shelter, the weight of her warning settling over him like a heavy fog. He had come looking for answers, but now he only had more questions. How could something as innocent as a dog be tied to such a dark past? Why were people afraid of it? And why had it found its way into their lives? That night, he couldn't sleep. The dog was lying quietly by the front door again, as it always did at night, its eyes glowing in the dim light. It seemed peaceful, unaware of the growing tension in the house. But the father couldn't stop thinking about the shelter workers' warning. He kept seeing the woman's face, her fearful eyes, the way she had looked over her shoulder, as though she were being watched. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story, something bigger than he had ever imagined. His wife noticed the change in him when she got home, the weariness in his eyes, the distracted way he moved through the house. What's going on? She asked, concern etched across her face. You look like you've seen a ghost. I think we've made a mistake, he said, his voice strained. We need to talk about the dog. She furrowed her brow. What do you mean? It's fine, right? I don't know, he admitted, his voice shaky. I went to the shelter today. I found out some things. Things I don't know how to explain. This dog isn't just some lost animal. It's been in other homes, and in each one, strange things happened. People talk about it like it's connected to something bad, something dangerous. She looked at him, disbelief flickering across her face. Are you saying we need to get rid of it? I don't know, he said. But there's something about this dog, something that's not right. And we need to be careful. That night, the family sat together, the dog between them. It seemed so normal, so calm, too calm. The kids, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, were unusually quiet. The father could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, but he couldn't bring himself to say the words. Should they get rid of the dog? Could they even do it, knowing the bond that had formed between them? Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the phone rang again. This time, the father didn't hesitate. He picked it up, his hand shaking as he heard the voice on the other end. Is this the family with the dog? The voice asked, sharp and urgent. Yes, he said, his voice low. What do you want? You need to stop asking questions, the voice said. You're getting too close to the truth. This isn't just a dog. It's part of something much bigger. You don't know what you're dealing with, and you need to let it go. You don't want to find out what happens if you don't. The line went dead again. This time, there was no doubt. The father could feel it deep in his bones. The dog was at the center of something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. But the question was, what would happen if they tried to find out the truth? What would they lose in the process? The tension in the house was unbearable now. Each member of the family felt the weight of the mystery pressing in on them, but no one knew how to face it. The dog remained as calm and silent as ever, its gaze never leaving them, as if it were waiting for them to make the next move. And as the family sat together, each lost in their own thoughts, the only thing they could agree on was one simple truth: things would never be the same. Not again. But what would happen next? No one knew. The house felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with unease. Days passed, but the tension only grew. The phone calls didn't stop. Each time the father picked up, the voice on the other end was a warning, a demand for them to get rid of the dog. You don't understand, the voice would say. It's not just a pet. It's dangerous. It's not safe. Get it out of your house before it's too late. The family was torn. The children still loved the dog, and despite everything, they felt a connection to it that couldn't be easily explained. But the father couldn't ignore the mounting fear, the strange occurrences that seemed to be happening around them. The whispers in the shadows. The way the dog would suddenly freeze, its ears perked up, its gaze fixed on the hallway, as if it was waiting for something or someone. The mother had noticed it too. There were times when she'd wake in the middle of the night, just like before, only this time she wasn't alone. The dog would be there, standing at the foot of her bed, watching her, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It was as though it was guarding her, or maybe watching over her, but in a way that felt more unsettling than protective. It was as if it was waiting for something. And each time she looked at it, she felt her heart race. Something wasn't right. But it was the kids that began to stir the most concern. The youngest, usually full of energy and laughter, had started to withdraw. He would spend long hours in his room, staring at the wall, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if lost in some deep thought. His drawings, once filled with bright colors and happy scenes, had turned dark and eerie. They were no longer simple pictures of animals or nature, but strange, shadowy shapes, figures lurking in the background, watching from the edges of the pages. The older child, too, had started acting strangely. At dinner one night, they noticed he was unusually quiet, his eyes darting nervously around the room, as though he was afraid of something just out of sight. When they asked him what was wrong, he wouldn't answer at first, but then, in a voice so soft it barely made a sound, he said, "The dog is watching us." He didn't seem to understand what he meant, but his words sent a chill down their spines. What did he see that they couldn't? The father tried to rationalize it. Maybe the stress of everything, the phone calls, the secrecy, the feeling of being watched had begun to affect their minds. But deep down, he knew something was off. The warnings, the odd behavior, the inexplicable sense of dread, it all felt too real. Then came the night that everything changed. The house had fallen silent, the kind of silence that comes just before something terrible happens. It was late, and everyone was asleep. The dog, as usual, was lying by the front door. But this time, something was different. The father awoke suddenly, heart pounding, his senses on high alert. It wasn't the sound of a phone call that had woken him, it was something else. A feeling. He lay still, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing. No creaks in the floorboards, no wind outside, just the eerie stillness of the house. But then, he heard a faint scratching sound. It was coming from the door. He froze. The dog was standing at the door, its ears raised, its tail still. But its eyes were wide, alert, staring into the dark hallway as if it had sensed something. He didn't know what it was, but his instinct told him to move. Slowly, he got out of bed, careful not to wake anyone else. His feet barely made a sound on the wooden floor as he approached the door. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't coming from the outside, it was coming from the inside. He reached for the door handle, his breath shallow, his heart racing. As his hand gripped it, the dog let out a low, guttural growl, its body tense, its eyes now fixed on him. The growl was deep, more animalistic than anything he had ever heard from the creature before. It was as though the dog was trying to warn him, to stop him from opening the door. But he couldn't stop now. He had to know what was on the other side. With a deep breath, he twisted the handle and swung the door open. The hallway was empty. No one was there. But the air felt wrong. Cold. Heavy. And then, he noticed it, the walls. They were lined with strange symbols, symbols he hadn't seen before. They weren't drawn with paint or marker, but scratched into the wood, as though someone or something had carved them into the surface over time. The symbols pulsed faintly, glowing with an eerie light. His stomach turned as he realized what he was looking at, something ancient. Something dark. His eyes darted to the end of the hallway. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. The dog behind him let out a sharp bark, snapping him back to reality. He turned to see it now standing next to him, its stance defensive, its eyes locked on the figure at the end of the hall. The father stepped back instinctively, but the dog didn't flinch. It stayed still, as though it was guarding him from whatever was lurking in the dark. The figure at the end of the hallway shifted, and for the first time, the father saw its face, a face that wasn't quite human. It was distorted, twisted in ways that defied logic. Its eyes glowed faintly, the same eerie glow that seemed to radiate from the symbols on the walls. Before the father could move, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving only a faint, lingering chill in the air. The dog barked again, urgently this time, and the father knew it was time to act. He needed to get his family out of the house. But as he turned to leave, the dog lunged at him, its teeth bared. It wasn't attacking, it was stopping him. "Stop," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. "What do you want from me?" The dog's growls grew louder, its body tense, but it didn't move. It was as if it was caught in some kind of internal battle, loyal to the family, yet bound to something darker, something it had been forced into. The father's mind raced, his thoughts spinning as the mystery deepened. This wasn't just a stray dog. It was tied to something far more sinister, something that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And now, as the figure disappeared and the dog blocked his path, the father realized that moment had arrived. But what was the truth? What did the dog want from them? What had they brought into their home? And could they stop whatever it was before it was too late? The room felt colder, the air more oppressive, as the father stood frozen, torn between the dog and the shadows lurking in the hallway. The mystery was unraveling, but the answers were nowhere in sight. And the danger, it seemed, was just beginning. The tension in the hallway was unbearable. The dog was still blocking his way, its body rigid, its eyes locked on him with a mix of loyalty and something darker, something far older. He had never seen it like this before, its usually friendly demeanor now replaced with a fierce protectiveness that seemed almost unnatural. The father's mind raced. He wanted to move, to get his family out of the house, but the dog wouldn't let him pass. And then, just as he stood there, paralyzed by uncertainty, something changed. The house itself seemed to shift. A low hum, barely perceptible at first, began to rise from the walls. The father's heart skipped a beat. It was as if the house itself was alive, responding to something or someone. The glow from the symbols on the walls pulsed more brightly, flickering like the heartbeat of some ancient creature trapped within the very structure of the building. And then, just as suddenly as the humming began, it stopped. Dead silence. The dog's growl faded into a low whimper. It wasn't the aggressive growl from before, but something softer, almost fearful. The father took a cautious step forward, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the dog. But before he could, the air seemed to shift once more, and a voice, low, guttural, and unmistakably human, whispered from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come back." The father froze, his blood running cold. It was a voice that felt like it came from everywhere and nowhere, as if the house itself was speaking, pulling him into its dark secrets. He turned toward the source of the voice, but there was no one there, no figure standing in the dark hallway. Just the shadows, thicker now, swirling as though alive. The dog, now shaking, pressed its body against his leg. It was no longer the fierce protector, it was a creature trapped in the same web of fear as him. The father bent down, his hand reaching for the dog's head, trying to reassure it, but even as he touched it, the dog stiffened. It was trembling, like it could sense something they both couldn't see, something coming. And then the house seemed to groan, as though waking from a long slumber. The walls creaked, the floorboards beneath them shifted. The shadows that had seemed so still began to move, swirling in unnatural patterns, like smoke rising from a fire. It was impossible to tell where they came from or where they were going, but the father knew one thing for sure: it was something alive. The dog let out a low, desperate whine, its eyes flicking nervously toward the front door, then back to the shadows in the hallway. It was trying to tell him something, but what? The father's head spun. He couldn't stay here, he knew that now. But the moment he turned to leave, the voice whispered again, this time louder, almost mocking. You can't leave. Not anymore. Not with it. The word had echoed in his mind. What was it? The dog? The house? Or something else entirely? He couldn't make sense of it. The tension was suffocating, the danger palpable. His hand was already on the door handle when the floor beneath him cracked a deep, resonating sound that sent a chill through his spine. The father's eyes shot down, and to his horror, the cracks in the floor weren't just random. They were forming a pattern that resembled the same symbols that had been etched into the walls. The same symbols that pulsed with a dark, otherworldly light. And as he stared at them, they began to glow more brightly, their edges sharp and jagged, as if they were alive, reaching out to him, pulling him in. The dog barked once, sharply, its voice cutting through the growing noise, but the father couldn't focus on it. His attention was fixed on the floor. On the symbols. He couldn't look away. And then, the ground beneath him cracked open. A deep, guttural roar filled the air, the sound reverberating through the entire house. The father stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest, and before he could react, something moved. From the cracks in the floor, something began to emerge, a shape, dark and formless at first, but as it rose higher, it took form. A shadow. A figure. A figure that wasn't human. The father's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The creature that emerged from the floor was like nothing he had ever seen. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched out unnaturally, its body covered in shifting shadows that seemed to breathe, pulse, and move like liquid. Its face, or what could be considered a face, was a hollow mask of darkness, with eyes that glowed like embers, burning into his very soul. The dog was no longer trembling. It was whining, its voice breaking with fear, its tail tucked between its legs as it backed away from the creature. The father turned to look at the dog, his mind racing. What was happening? Why was the dog so terrified? Had it known all along? The creature's eyes flicked toward him. And for a moment, time seemed to stop. A voice, ancient and harsh, whispered from the darkness, as though speaking directly to him. You brought it here. Now you will face the consequences. The words burned through his mind. It was as if the house itself was alive, as though it had been waiting for him, for the dog, for this very moment. The father's breath quickened. He had to get out, but the door was too far. The creature was blocking his path, its hollow eyes locked on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. His heart hammered in his chest. There was no way out. The dog, still cowering at his feet, let out one final, desperate bark, its voice more broken than before. And in that moment, the father understood. The dog had been the key. It wasn't just a stray animal. It had been tied to this house, to whatever was coming out of the shadows. The dog had known. It had always known. The father's mind was spinning as he backed away, the creature's glowing eyes never leaving his. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the very air was pulling him toward it. He was trapped, and he could feel the walls of the house closing in around him. And then, just as the creature took a step forward, something happened. The dog barked one more time, louder this time, with a sharpness that cut through the thickening air. The ground shook beneath them, and the lights flickered as if the house itself was reacting to the call. The father had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure: the stakes were higher now than ever before. There was no turning back. Whatever this creature was, whatever this house was hiding, it was coming for them, and there was no escape unless they figured out what it wanted. But time was running out. The father's mind raced, but the truth remained elusive. The only thing he knew for sure was that something far greater than he had imagined was about to be unleashed, and he had no idea how to stop it. The ground beneath the father trembled again, but this time, it wasn't the house shifting. It was something else, something that moved through the air, something alive. The shadows seemed to recoil, and for a brief moment, the figure standing before him faltered. The glow in its eyes dimmed. The dog barked again, louder, more forcefully this time, and the father felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just fear anymore. It was desperation. But it was also clarity. He understood. He reached down to the dog, his hand trembling as he touched its fur. For a brief second, it looked up at him, its eyes filled with a sorrowful understanding. It wasn't just the house that had been waiting for them, it was the dog, too. The creature in front of him wasn't just some force of nature, it was bound to the house. It was bound to the dog. And the dog was bound to them. He didn't know how he knew, but in that moment it all clicked. He realized that the house had been waiting for a family, for a host, for someone to awaken it. And they had unwittingly given it what it needed: their presence, their connection to this world. But there was something more. The father's thoughts raced back to the night they found the dog. The night it was so quiet, so abandoned on the street. It hadn't been a stray at all. It had been sent to them. And the whispers, the strange feeling that something was off about the whole thing, it wasn't just coincidence. With a sudden burst of determination, the father stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "What do you want?" he demanded, his eyes locked onto the creature's glowing form. For a moment, it didn't answer. The shadows around it seemed to stretch, and the air grew thick, like it was trying to suffocate him. Then, the voice came soft, chilling, yet familiar. It was as though the voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "The dog is not just an animal. It is a vessel," the voice rumbled. "A vessel for me." The father's heart dropped into his stomach. The dog had never been just a dog. It was a prison, a trap, a conduit for something far darker, far older than he could have imagined. The creature wasn't from this world, it had been trapped here, bound to the house, bound to the dog, waiting for someone foolish enough to bring it out. The dog growled softly, a sound more mournful than menacing. Its fur bristled, but it didn't move to attack. The father knelt down, eyes locked with the dog's, feeling a connection that ran deeper than he could explain. It wasn't its fault. The dog had been an innocent, a pawn in a much larger game. And now, it was trying to help them. It was trying to warn them. The creature lurched forward, its long limbs reaching out, and the shadows seemed to ripple in its wake. The air grew colder, the pressure more suffocating. There was no time left. The father had only one chance. With a deep breath, he grabbed the dog and ran toward the front door. The creature let out a low, bone-chilling roar behind him, but he didn't look back. The door was locked, and with every second, the room seemed to close in tighter. He had to get out. As he reached for the doorknob, the ground shook violently, the walls around them groaning like the house itself was alive and protesting. He twisted the handle with all his might, the door refusing to budge at first. But then, with a final push, it gave way, and the cold night air rushed in, as if the world outside was offering them an escape. But before they could step through the door, a sharp cry rang out behind them. The dog barked, its voice desperate and pleading, its fur bristling with an energy the father had never felt before. He looked down at the dog, realizing with sudden clarity that it was fighting something, fighting for control, for freedom. It was no longer just a family that was in danger, the dog, too, was trapped in the grip of whatever dark force had claimed it. The father stepped back, pulling the dog away from the door. He couldn't leave the animal behind. Not like this. Not after everything they'd been through. He had to help the dog break free. The ground beneath them cracked open once again, but this time, the symbols on the floor had shifted, rearranged themselves into a new pattern, a circle. A binding. The creature had done it, it was locking them in. The dog howled as the shadows reached out toward it, and for a brief moment, the father felt a surge of helplessness. But then, he remembered the one thing that had always been true love. The bond he had with his family, with this dog, was stronger than whatever darkness was lurking in the house. The house was trying to pull them into the shadows, but the father wasn't going to let that happen. He had to act fast. Without thinking, he grabbed the dog, pulling it close. In that moment, the house shook violently. The symbols on the floor glowed, but so did the dog. The glow wasn't eerie, it was pure, like light breaking through a storm. The dog's fur began to shimmer, and with a roar that shook the foundation of the house, the creature lunged at them, but it was too late. The light from the dog burst forth, shining like a beacon in the dark, and the house screamed. The walls cracked, and the floor gave way as the creature let out a final, earth-shattering roar. The house broke. Everything collapsed in on itself, and for a fleeting moment, the father thought they might not make it. But then, it was over. The house fell silent, the oppressive air lifting. The creature, the shadows, everything vanished. All that remained was the dog, standing at the father's feet, calm, its eyes soft and full of something that could only be described as peace. The father stood there, panting, his heart still racing. The dog wagged its tail, as if nothing had happened at all. But he knew better. They had broken the curse, freed the house, freed the dog. But there was still something left. A feeling in the air, a whisper. As the family stepped out into the fresh night air, the door to the house slammed shut behind them, a final click that sounded almost final. And then, the dog turned to the father, its eyes glowing softly in the moonlight, and for the briefest of moments, he thought he saw something else in them. Something that made him pause, a shadow of something ancient, something still watching, waiting. But then, just as quickly it was gone. And in the silence that followed, the father knew that their lives had been forever changed. But the question lingered in the air, had they truly escaped, or was this just the beginning of something even darker yet to come? The quiet outside felt like a fresh start. The air was crisp, cool, with a softness that hadn't been there before. The father stood at the edge of the yard, looking back toward the house once a place of fear, now silent and still. No creaking walls. No ominous shadows. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, his chest finally loosening from the weight of the night's events. The dog stood beside him, its eyes soft and calm, as if nothing had happened. As if it hadn't been the very creature that had carried the weight of something ancient and dark within it. The father knelt down to pet it, his fingers brushing its fur. It was warm, solid, and real. He hadn't imagined it, hadn't imagined the terror they'd just faced. But now, as he gazed into the dog's eyes, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The dog had brought them through it all. It had been their guide, their protector in a world far darker than they could have ever anticipated. It had endured the horrors of the house, had fought its own battle. And now, it was free. The family had won. But the cost had been greater than they ever expected. They would never look at the world the same way again. The father couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness hadn't been entirely defeated. It hadn't been eradicated, it had just changed. The creature, the shadows, the curse, whatever it had been, was still out there, somewhere, waiting. And though the house had fallen silent, the memory of it all clung to the air, to the dog, to their lives. They all knew they couldn't just walk away and pretend that nothing had happened. The strange whisperings in the night, the crackling air, and the way the dog had changed, it wasn't something that could be dismissed. There was no ignoring it anymore. They began to drive away from the house, the streetlights casting long shadows behind them as they left. The father felt the weight of the past hours hanging in the air. His mind raced, replaying the events, the revelations. The house, the creature, the strange symbols, it was all so overwhelming. He had never believed in anything supernatural, never imagined such things could be real. Yet here he was, leaving behind a house that wasn't just a house. It was a vessel of something far older, far more terrifying than he had thought possible. "Are you okay?" his partner asked, her voice gentle, filled with concern. He nodded, though his heart didn't feel settled. "I think so," he said softly. "But I don't know what comes next." The car continued down the darkened road, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. They were going home, they were safe, they had survived. But there was still the strange feeling, the one that had never quite left, the sense that something was unfinished, something still lingered. "Do you think it's over?" she asked, her voice soft but unsure. The father's gaze moved to the dog, who sat quietly in the back seat, its eyes calm and steady as it looked out the window, as if it had lived through 1,000 lifetimes, bearing the weight of a secret it could never speak. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know if we're truly free from it. But I think we've done something, we've broken a chain. I think the house is gone. The creature is gone, but the darkness, it's still there. Watching." His partner remained quiet for a moment. The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of shared fear and the unknown future that awaited them. Then, she sighed and shook her head, as if to shake off the lingering sense of dread. "I don't want to think about that right now," she said. "I just want to think about the fact that we're alive. That we're together." The father smiled faintly. She was right. They were together. And they were alive. It wasn't just the house they had escaped, it was the monster that had been inside them all along. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty. It wasn't gone, but it had been tested. And they had come through stronger. The drive felt long, but in some ways, it was the most peaceful stretch of road they'd ever traveled. Even with the lingering unease, there was a quiet joy in knowing they had escaped the grip of something terrible. By the time they reached their home, the first light of dawn was breaking through the sky. It was a new day, a new beginning. They parked the car in the driveway, and the father sat for a moment, just watching the morning light filter through the trees. "Let's go inside," his partner said, reaching for his hand. "Let's start over." They stepped out of the car together, and the dog followed them, its tail wagging slightly, as if it too was glad to be somewhere familiar, somewhere safe. Inside the house, everything was still. There were no echoes of shadows, no hum in the walls. It was the kind of silence that should have been peaceful, but the father couldn't shake the feeling that it was too silent. The house felt empty, stripped of its previous weight. It was as if it had been cleansed. Or maybe they had been cleansed. The dog walked over to the living room and lay down by the window, its body relaxing as it watched the sun rise. The father couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe as he watched the dog. In that moment, he understood that the dog had been both a protector and a bridge, a creature that had brought them through something beyond their understanding. It had been more than just a pet, it had been a savior, in a sense. And yet, despite the peace that had settled over the house, the father couldn't let go of that nagging feeling, that whisper in the back of his mind. Had they really escaped? Or was this just the calm before the storm? He walked over to the window, staring out at the world outside, the world that seemed so normal, so quiet. Had he imagined it? He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the feeling. He didn't want to believe it, didn't want to acknowledge it. But deep down, he knew. He had learned too much to pretend that the darkness had truly gone. But as long as they were together, as long as they stood strong, they could face whatever came next. The dog had shown them that. It had faced the darkness without flinching, had been the key to their survival. And for that, the father knew he would be forever grateful. As they sat down to breakfast, a quiet understanding passed between them. The past few days had changed them all. They had seen the impossible, had survived what no one should have ever had to endure. They knew the world wasn't as simple as it had seemed before. But now, more than ever, they were ready to face whatever came. Together. The house was quiet. The dog rested peacefully by the window. And in that silence, the father allowed himself a brief moment of peace. For now they were safe. But the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun.